IMF Managing Director Christine Lagarde says the global economic weather is changing. In a speech ahead of the IMF and World Bank annual meetings next week, she said trade barriers are already slowing growth as President Trump continues to push for world trade rules to be reformed. Paula Newton spoke to the head of the International Trade Center, a body allied to the UN and WTO, and she said the US might not like the process.
If you want to reform the rules of international trade, you have to accept to be seated around the table, and you have to accept that others will be making intelligent arguments that maybe you will have to move from your position, that it's not you dictating the rules. In the 21st century, the rules are agreed by countries around the table. This is why we live in a multipolar world, whether we like it or not.
Now, Lagarde's first deputy at the IMF is David Lipton. He joined me from Washington and told us he expects continued strong growth in the US compared with the slowdown in Europe, Japan and elsewhere.
I think it's great that they've done a deal. Now, I have to say, we haven't seen the details of it, but we all believe that NAFTA needed modernization. And I hope that when we see the details, we'll find that this is a better agreement for all three countries involved, and that will deepen the links and the supply chains among the countries. It would provide also a way for the trade to be more satisfactory to people in all three countries. I think it's also important for the rest of the world who've been wondering whether the rhetoric and trade actions from the Trump administration would lead to actual deals. And I think there's a fair amount of relief around the world that if one keeps at it, perhaps one can find a way through to a more harmonious way of dealing with disagreements that will actually lead to good outcomes.
And was that what was it the Trump administration primarily in the mind of the managing director when she made her comments about increasing trade protectionism? Because it would seem that Washington has led the way in that.
Well, look, what we're looking at is how we can encourage more integration around the world so that there can be gains for trade for emerging markets and poor countries, so that there can be a deepening of trade relations that includes less barriers to trade and services and so on. And, you know, frankly, a lot of countries have trade practices that need to be modernized. And, you know, it's the impulse that gave rise to the discontent in the United States comes from the fact that the U.S. has liberalized its trade quite a bit. Other countries have done a lot, but there's more that they can do. Now, you know, our point all along was let's do this in a harmonious way, in a cooperative way, so that everybody can gain. It is, you know, it is dangerous when you see tit-for-tat escalation of trade barriers. What we want to see, of course, is a resolution to the differences.
David, in the managing director's speech, she says the outlook has since become less bright, referring to economic growth, as you'll see from our updated forecast next week. Look, I know you don't want to break the embargo on the WEO with the numbers, but it's reasonable to assume from that next week you are going to revise down global economic growth. Can you confirm that?
Let me say two things, Richard. First, we do want to stress that growth is strong, and this has been very helpful, not just to advanced economies, but to emerging markets and developing economies. We've seen incomes rising. We've seen wages rising. We've seen unemployment falling. We've seen poverty being reduced. So before we get tied up in the second decimal place or the risks in the future, let's acknowledge that this has been a growth recovery after many years since the global financial crisis. We do see it becoming uneven. Stronger growth in the U.S., some weakening in Europe and Japan and elsewhere. And yes, there'll probably be some slight tick towards a slightly slower growth. We'll see about that when the numbers come out. But it's still a strong growth situation. The question is more about the longer term. Are there risks that could derail growth? Is there a recession in the future? Those are subjects that I hope the whole international community will dig into when we're all together in Indonesia.
Finally, emerging markets and the issue of emerging markets. India's had trouble, obviously, with its currency against the dollar. Russia's got issues as a result of oil. Argentina is already at the IMF and increased its bailout. Turkey has problems. How concerned are you that you're slowly watching the unwinding of economies in the emerging markets?
It's very hard to know how many countries and which countries will have difficulties turn to really very stressful situations or crises. What we see right now is that many emerging market countries really are not coming under serious stress or are not being affected very significantly at all. So far, it's countries that have their own fragilities, some vulnerabilities to the normalization of monetary policy in the United States. You know, there are a few that have had quite severe problems, and we're doing what we can to help them. You know, we never know when circumstances will change, and more countries may fall into difficulties. But right now, I'd say it is a select group where markets have become more concerned.
Deputy Managing Director of the IMF on the global weather forecast. The markets will be closing in New York markets just about 8 minutes from now, and that's where we look. Holding on to the gains of the day, just slipped a tad or so. We'll go deeper into that after the break.